Welcome to another episode of the Confessions of a Recovering Landlord podcast, where you'll learn the secrets commercial landlords would prefer you not know. I'm your host, Jan Gibbons, along with my co-host and experienced commercial real estate broker, Bob Gibbons.
That's me.
Brought to you by Riata Commercial Realty, where we exclusively represent users of office and warehouse properties. Landlords have representation. Do you? Hello, podcast listeners. We're happy to have you back. Today, we have a scolding in store for you. That's what everybody wants to hear when they dial into this.
It's not a scolding. It's a helpful word to the wise.
It's a warning.
Okay.
But I'm starting off with a funny story. A guy I used to work for in insurance was a scream, but highly intelligent in all things insurance. And whenever we'd have a question, we'd always ask him, hey, is this covered? Do you think they're going to do it like this? Will there be depreciation? And his answer, do not be afraid to read your policy. And I thought that was brilliant because it's like all answers are there. And trust me, sometimes it's not addressed there. And he would call the State Board of Insurance and he would get an answer. And he wasn't done till he had an answer. And he'd come told everyone in the office. But you know what? I learned a lot that way. Yeah. But that was always his go-to is be unafraid to read your policy. And in today's podcast, I think you have the same message, don't you?
Except it's not a policy, it's a lease.
That's right.
I've often told the story about how when I was on the landlord side, I was an asset manager. I had a lot of property managers and leasing agents who either reported to me directly or, as if I were the client kind of thing. And so they would come to me with different situations. Hey, Bob, we got such and such happening with an existing tenant. What do you want to do? And my response was always, I don't know. What does the lease say? And it was uncanny how in every single case, nobody had ever thought to go look at the lease. And so I'm always like, come on, we spend all this time and effort and money negotiating these leases that are 40 to 50 to 100 pages long with all kinds of complexity to them and involving attorneys on both sides. And then we don't even read them whenever some issue comes up.
It's the governing document.
It is.
It's your Bible.
Duh. So, it didn't take those people very long to figure out, don't go to Bob with a problem if you haven't read the lease. And
don't go to Bob. Period.
And bring a solution, recommendation along with it. And so what I'm really having a struggle with right now is that I find that tenants do the same thing. Now, I can excuse a tenant far more quickly in not reading their lease than somebody who's theoretically in the commercial real estate business, because the tenant's not in the real estate business in most cases.
That's why we're here.
They're in other kinds of industries, and we deal with everybody from software developers to distributors to manufacturers to financial services, you name it, and medical. And we love them, working with all of them, but they need to read their lease. And this is an issue when, let's say, if they're going to negotiate a lease in the first place. I've had clients say, well, I'm not going to hire an attorney because I trust you, Bob. And I'm like, well, you're an idiot.
I'm sorry. I'm not through laughing yet.
This is a short podcast, I think, today. And it's like, come on, I understand very well how the practical tenant landlord relationship works and how landlords really manage buildings. Cause I was a landlord guy for 20 years. So I really understand all that. But what I'm not is an attorney. And so I can't put it in the legally correct language and make sure that it really works the way it should and the way a judge is going to interpret it, should it ever come to that. Well, what set me off in all this and is the impetus for this particular podcast is that when we deal with a company that is going to lease a space like a flex space or a warehouse industrial space, or even a standalone building where the tenant is responsible for a lot of things that they wouldn't be responsible for in a multi-tenant office building. They really need to read that lease very carefully, because in an office building, multi-tenant office building, high rise, the landlord's doing so many things for you. They're cleaning the common areas. They're cleaning your space. They're providing the air conditioning system and maintaining that. They're maintaining the roof, the parking garage, the landscaping. I mean, just on and on and on. They're doing almost everything. Even if it's a triple net lease, they still are arranging all those things. But you
Right.
go into all those other kind of properties that I mentioned, now it's the tenant's issue. And the tenant has to arrange for a lot of those things. And so whenever a client's thinking about going to a building like that, and they're coming from a multi-tenant office building, I'm always saying, look, understand that you're going to be the one responsible for all these things. And you need to be prepared to arrange for those things and manage those things. And are you really up to that? Do you have somebody who's going to be able to do that? And you're going to have to allocate a part of their time, which means their salary and benefits to that. So my point here is that read the lease, know what you're signing up for, know what you have to do. Well, in all those kinds of situations, a lot of times the landlord makes the tenant fully responsible for the air conditioning, maintenance, and repairs, and possibly full replacement of the unit if it goes bust. So how do you protect yourself if you're a tenant? Well, one of the first things you do is, of course, hire Riata Commercial Realty to be your agent. Are you happy with that?
It's getting good, but I've got more to say.
I just thought I'd beat you to the punch. Hire an agent who knows what they're doing in that product type. Number two, make sure you understand what the landlord's asking you to do. Number three, how old is that air conditioning unit? How is it maintained? Does it require any updates right now? Is the landlord going to deliver it in good working order? Well, if it's a unit that is 15, 20 years old, maybe you ought to be asking the landlord to replace that unit right now. Guess what? Landlords don't want to replace units. So maybe the next step would then be to say, all right, if you're not going to replace the unit, give me a brand new unit, then I want you to provide me some protection. Number one, I want a guarantee that that you're going to bring it up to a good working order before I move in. You're also going to give me a warranty on it for like 6 to 12 months, where if it dies, I'm not responsible for repairing or replacing it. And even after that first 6 or 12 months, then we have some sort of threshold above which I'm not having to pay for it as the landlord. I mean, as the tenant. So maybe that threshold, and what we usually ask for, is $500. If a unit goes bad, and I have to spend, if it's going to cost, let's say, $2,000 to replace a part of it, well, as the tenant, I'm going to pay the first $500 and the landlord pays the balance. If I have to replace the whole thing, it's going to cost $10,000 or $20,000. I'm going to pay the first $500, and landlord, you're going to pay the rest. So that's kind of a deductible type thing. It's almost like an insurance where the landlord is the insurance company and the tenant's paying the first deductible. And if the landlord replaces one of those units, then there's no further deductible. There's no protection beyond that. Seems fair. We've had clients that have actually faced this. I had a client years ago that 3 to 6 months before their lease expired, their air conditioning unit died, and they had to spend $10,000 to replace it. Now, fortunately, they were smart. The landlord came to them and said, "Hey, look, we'll pay for that if you'll just sign this 5-year lease extension." And they said, "No, you know what? We'll go ahead and pay it, and then we'll let Bob talk to you about the lease extension." I was not their agent when they signed the original lease. So we ended up going and negotiating a lease extension, which gave us some free rent and some improvements, and also paid them back for the new AC unit they just paid for. We had it happen with another client. I think it was about a year before their lease expired, and we were able to do the same thing. Again, it was a lease that we had not negotiated when they moved into the building originally, but we were able to negotiate an extension and get the money reimbursed to them. In those cases, you have to give the landlord something that is good for them, which is a longer lease.
Time.
Yeah, time.
Longer term.
Time of guaranteed income. But we've also had a client who didn't maintain the AC units. And that's one thing to say. In all these situations, the tenant's responsible for the preventive maintenance of the units. air conditioning, hot water heaters, whatever. If you're responsible for doing that, and if the lease says that you have to have a service contract that comes in and does maintenance every 3 months, changes the filters and greases and lubes it and all that, you better do that, because if you don't, the lease may, and often does, say that the landlord's warranty above your deductible is only going to apply if you've maintained those units according and had that service contract. And we actually have had a client who did not have a service contract, did not maintain it quarterly. And when there was damage to the units from a hailstorm, their HVAC contractor came in and said, well, you got all this damage from the hail, but also these units are, 13, 15 years old. Maybe you should be just replacing the whole units anyway. So he contacted the landlord, and the landlord's first response was, okay, yeah, we understand our responsibility in the lease. Please send us over a copy of your service contract and the reports from the quarterly service you've had done since you moved into the building. And he couldn't do that.
Zero.
And the lease specifically said if the tenant did not do those things, did not have that service contract and the quarterly maintenance, it constituted a negligence, and therefore no liability on the landlord's side. Now,
I wanted to say two things real quick. The two areas I see this really come through is on OpEx and on insurance.
Operating expenses and insurance.
Right. And we provide a lease brief for all the leases that we do, and it clearly states on there what you are to do. And sometimes tenants just forget, but I also kind of feel like the landlord lets us slide, because we tell them this is what is required on your insurance. And so they get a certificate of insurance. They provide it to the landlord. Landlord said, yeah, that looks good, when it didn't really meet everything in that lease.
Right.
And they're not going to push the issue until it comes to a loss.
Right.
And same thing with OpEx here.
They're not
It was clearly stated in the lease. It was on our lease brief, and it wasn't done. And the landlord never checked up on him until
Right.
he comes and brings a problem to them.
But you know what?
Even though you might have years where they don't say anything about it, it still can come back and bite you.
But nothing in the lease says that the landlord is obligated to call you up and check up on you to make sure you're doing what you're required to do in the lease.
No, I do take exception with the cert. On a COI, it should have met what the underlying coverages should have shown. And a lot of times they'll accept it, and it doesn't conform with what the lease requires. But I guarantee you, they'll be looking at it if there's a loss.
Exactly. But the landlord not doing what they should do is in no way an excuse for the tenants not doing what they're obligated to do.
But what I'm saying is, don't rely on the landlord to be your daddy and say,
absolutely,
you get your report card done, you got to do it on your own.
Absolutely. It's like in college, I was dating a girl and she got a traffic ticket for speeding and couldn't talk her way out of it with the cop. And she came home to daddy, who had bailed her out 2 or 3 times before. And I came over to visit that night. She was pretty upset. And I was like, what's wrong? She's like, I got another speeding ticket. And dad said, handle it. He wasn't going to bail her out again. I was like, finally, I can't believe he did the first 2 or 3 times.
Caveat to the story, that wasn't me.
It was not
while I was in college.
You were,
and I knew how to take care of my tickets.
You still know how to take care of yourself. Anyway, so the whole point of this podcast is read your lease and do what it says. Do not say, well, I'm going to skip that because I don't think there's anything wrong, or it's working well, or the
landlord's not riding me.
Oh yeah.
That I think that's the big caveat here.
Just because they haven't asked for it doesn't mean they're not going to ask for it in the time of need. So do it. And, in this situation that we're talking about, this just happened recently. So I really don't know how this is going to ultimately play out. He is required, to your point, of to have insurance on his machinery. I hope he has that, and I hope they will pay for it. But to be determined. And, a 13 or 15-year-old AC unit should still be working just fine. that should not be a time when that's dying on you in most cases. So anyway.
Warning over. Thanks for dialing in. Next time, it'll be a party for everyone. Goodbye. Thank you for listening. And just a reminder to send in questions to see if we can stump Bob.
Not going to happen.
We really appreciate your taking the time to tune into this episode. We would love it if you would give us a 5-star rating on whatever platform you're listening to this on. And if you are on our YouTube channel, we would love to read your feedback in the comment section. Also, be sure to subscribe so you get notified when we publish new episodes. Thanks, and see you next time.
Bye.